of a two-state solution is going to look like. The question is, how many more deaths are we going to see on both sides before it's implemented?
The two leaders may not emerge from Monday's meeting as personal friends, but most expect an end to the era of public antipathy. Mike Vaccaro, Al Jazeera, Washington.
Well, to discuss more on the meeting, let's bring in Shamar Alzani. He's a former deputy spokesman for Israel's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, a former deputy ambassador for Israel in Kenya, currently executive director of the Northeast region of Stand With Us. That's a pro-Israel advocacy group. He's joining us here in the studio tonight. And Rabbi Michael Lerner, editor of Tikkun magazine, a progressive Jewish interfaith magazine based in Berkeley. Thank you for joining us out there in California. Gentlemen, as a starting point for our discussion about the upcoming meeting, allow me to read for you a quote that appears in tomorrow's New York Times that I think summarizes the nature of the relationship, which is one of animosity. In the words of the author of this report, animosity is the worst in more than 2 decades. Netanyahu feels disrespected and misled by a president he thinks does not have Israel's best interests at heart. Mr. Obama feels aggrieved at being portrayed as anti-Israel, even though he has provided extensive security and fought Palestinian efforts seeking recognition as a state at the United Nations. So, first, to you, sir, what do you think of that appraisal of the state of play between the two leaders?
First of all, thank you very much for having me, Randall. It's a pleasure to be here on the show. I must say it's not the first time that we might enter into a disagreement with the New York Times. When it comes to Israel-U.S. relations, we must look beyond the personal. Yes, there may be some personal issues between Mr. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Mr. President Barack Obama, but at the end of the day, you have to look at this relationship in the way it should be. This is a strategic alliance in nowadays world in which Israel and the United States play together as partners in order to cope with the many challenges we see. I mean, if you look at the region today, just recently, the attack on the Russian plane, if indeed it turns out to be a bombing, and as reported by several media outlets, by information provided by Israel to the West, it may have been confirmed that Islamic State operatives are the ones who committed this. If you look at the situation in Syria, if you look at what's happening elsewhere, there is much to gain from the collaboration.
But before we get to the strategic issues, and there's some questions in terms of Syria, in terms of Palestine, two-state solution. Let me get the rabbi's state of point of view on that description of the relationship. Rabbi?
Yes, I agree with what's just been said, that it's not a personal issue at all. It's an issue of policy. And from the standpoint of many liberal and progressive Jews in the United States, the Netanyahu administration has been a disaster for Israel. Many of us want to see a strong Israel and believe that the most egregious undermining of Israel comes from the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. And it's time for the Netanyahu government to take steps to end that occupation. Unfortunately, they're committed to perpetuating it. It's been going on for 48 years, and they continue to act as though they think they can keep it going for another 48 or 50 years.
Rabbi, let me interrupt
That's a disaster. That's a disaster for Jews. It's a disaster for Israel.
Rabbi, as you know, for some months, the Obama administration, through the offices of Secretary Kerry, basically did a shuttle diplomacy between Israel and Palestinian leaders, trying to reach some kind of restart of the talks towards a two-state solution. Seems like it's over. The White House is saying they don't expect any progress on a two-state solution during the president's term, and probably not any talks. That's a pretty dire assessment, isn't it?
Why would one expect anything different when Prime Minister Netanyahu was reelected precisely by insisting that he would never allow, during his time in office, which was the next 4.5 years, for a Palestinian state to emerge? So obviously there's no incentive whatsoever for the Palestinians to engage in these negotiations, which are a total sham, unless we've got a government in Israel that says, yes, we are willing to give to the Palestinian people the same national self-determination that we Jews rightly fought for ourselves.
Let me get Mr. Zani in on this issue. Do you agree with him, or do you think there's some other way of looking at this issue that might get the two sides, as we say, off the dime?
Well, I'll tell you, Randall, let's look back for a minute. Where were we in the year 2000? when the Palestinian state with a capital in East Jerusalem was offered to the Palestinian leader at the time by Arafat, and the prime minister was not Mr. Netanyahu, it was Mr. Barak. Where were we in accordance with the account of former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, who attested at her memoirs that Prime Minister Olmert in 2008 offered Mahmoud Abbas, the same Abu Mazen today, a Palestinian state? I don't think it's fair to lay the blame entirely on the Israeli leadership, and in addition, claiming for such statements or other statements in the course of a campaign, that's not policy. The Prime Minister adhered to the two-state solution and said, let's negotiate. Ramallah and Jerusalem are very close. It doesn't take much, 45 minutes for the two leaders to meet. The Prime Minister indicated many a time, I'm willing to sit with Mahmoud Abbas. Where is it?
Well, what about the settlements, though? I mean, isn't that a really hard point? As long as Israel continues to maintain the settlements and build new settlements, Abbas is saying he can't talk. It would be hypocritical.
Is there no point to negotiate when there is disagreement between the parties? Number one. Number two, if you look into the actual numerical account, forget about proclamations or declarations, the number of new settlements built under this Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, has been the least in the course of the last decade. Less than under Prime Minister Sharon, less than under Prime Minister Olmert. In addition, look at it from the viewpoint of the Israeli public. When Israel withdrew from 5 settlements in northern Samaria and clearly evacuated the Gaza Strip, what emerged? What happened to the situation in Israel? And the Israeli public needs to know that next time something like this happens, we're actually able to live more in peace rather than at war.
Hold your thought. Rabbi Lerner, any comment on that? Do you agree that perhaps...
I mean, first of all, the last time that Israel and Palestine were negotiating, they entered into negotiations with a commitment from Israel to release prisoners at a certain time arrangement every few months. When it came to releasing the last set of prisoners, which was part of the agreement that got them into the negotiations in the first place, Israel refused to follow through on the agreement that it had made. And as a result, the negotiations collapsed. Let's understand one thing here. This is not a negotiation between two equal parties. One of the parties is occupying militarily the other one. And the other one, the Palestinians, have absolutely no power in this situation. So to bring them back into negotiations, what they're thinking is, what's the point of this except to give a kind of cover for the continuation of the negotiation,
Rabbi, I'm sorry,
continuation of the occupation.
Rabbi, I have to interrupt you here.
Yeah.
We want to move to another point and also get some discussion about President Obama and America's role in this entire discussion. Let's go to a recent poll by the Israel Democracy Institute. It shows some astonishing numbers. Israelis were surveyed on how to handle security situation in light of the recent upsurge in violence in the West Bank. It shows that some 53% of Israelis support the extrajudicial killings of alleged Palestinian attackers on the spot, even after the attackers have been arrested and are presumably no longer a threat. It also found that 80% of Israelis believe that the family homes of alleged Palestinian attackers should be demolished by the Israeli army. Now, given those kind of poll results, it would seem to support, Mr. Zani, the hard-line stance of Bibi Netanyahu in dealing with violence on Israeli soil.
Well, you know, if you look at the situation in Israel in the past few weeks, over a month, this is an unbearable reality where every day Israelis wake up to incidents where Palestinians, supposedly powerless, Rabbi, are wielding knives, cars, guns, and attacking innocent Israelis at bus stops, in the middle of the road, executing people for no reason. Killing people will get Israelis or Palestinians nowhere. So, in light of such an atmosphere and in a heated time, I don't think it's fair to judge Israeli public opinion by what's being said in the heat of the moment. This is a very tough situation for Israel, and the only way for it to end is if Palestinians choose to put down their weapons and start negotiating.
But let me ask you this. Can you put yourself in the shoes of Palestinians who feel repressed, who have to walk 2 miles to get to the other side of their property because of the wall, who do not feel that there is any progress being made at all, and then their relatives who are in the West Bank, who are on Gaza, because of the recent conflict there and the rebuilding program that has not exactly begun? I mean, can you put yourself in their shoes?
Every day. I can put myself in their shoes every day. And I ask you this, Randall, and I ask Rabbi and the viewers, how can there be progress if on the one hand you won't negotiate, because by negotiating there will be no progress, but then you're angry that there is no progress and there is no negotiations. The only way to put this to the test is to sit together and negotiate and reach an agreement, and I can assure you that the majority of Israeli public opinion is ready for a two-state solution and ready to give Palestinians what the Israelis have promised over 20 years ago during the Oslo Accords, which, if I want to remind the rabbi and the viewers, was not under UN or American pressure. It was an Israeli initiative.
Well, I want to thank both of you for joining us, and what we failed to discuss because we did not really have enough time here is what President Obama can do, if anything, to move the situation towards a little bit of a positive kind of feeling.
Amen.
But Mr. Azani, Rabbi Lerner, thank you for joining us. Shahir Azani, the spokesman for Israel's foreign ministry, and Rabbi Michael Lerner, editor of Tikkun magazine. Thank you for being with us on Al Jazeera America. When we come back, for the second time in a week of deadly cyclones, landfall in war-ravaged Yemen, plus